Well, once again, good afternoon, everybody. It does my heart good to see everyone here. I thank you for the social distancing, so we're keeping ourselves safe. We're spread out. Little too cool for you today? Try wearing bishop's robes during this heat. But I thank you for coming despite the heat. This actually is one of my favorite places to come in the region. It's always so peaceful, so beautiful here. This mission, of course, is one of the most beautiful. And of course, the setting, look at it. So a joy to come up here, a joy to see all of you. And you know, we're celebrating, as I mentioned, the Feast of the Queenship of Mary. But we're also focused today in a special way on St. Junípero Serra. And on this statue you can see right behind me. We are gathered here today in defense of this statue. You know, I've been following this thing now for several months. The attacks on the statues of Junípero Serra. So up in San Francisco, down in Los Angeles, of course in Ventura, closer to home. Here's what's really bothered me, everybody. When I hear this language of Junípero Serra being compared to Hitler, the missions being compared to concentration camps, look, I understand, the church understands the very legitimate concerns of some of the protesters. Yes, we are concerned about racism. Yes, we're concerned about oppression. Yes, we're concerned about righting social wrongs. We're also concerned about voices from the past that have not been heard. They've been repressed. I understand all of that. But what I won't tolerate, what I don't understand, is besmirching the reputation and memory of this great saint of the church represented by this statue. I think there we have to draw the line, and we have to tell the story of Junípero Serra, because the problem is his story is being told by many others who are getting it at best only partially right. I think we have to stand with this great saint. I was privileged, it was just 5 years ago, when Pope Francis himself came to our shores. He came to Washington, and I was there for the Mass of canonization, this beautiful moment. Francis himself, there's no one on the world stage today who is a greater friend of the marginalized, the oppressed, the poor, nobody more sensitive to the very legitimate concerns of people today. And he presided with great enthusiasm over the canonization of Junípero Serra. You know, I think, friends, what's happening is people are laying at the feet of Junípero Serra everything that bugs them about 18th century Spanish colonialism. And let's be honest, there was plenty wrong with 18th century Spanish colonialism. But in my judgment, this is not the right man to blame for those problems. And I think we need to tell his story and resist this crude characterization of him as somehow the moral equivalent of Hitler and these beautiful missions, the equivalent of concentration camps. That's just nonsense. So let me say a few words about Junípero Serra to remind you of who this man was and what he stood for. He was born Miguel Serra, that was his original name, his baptismal name, on that beautiful island of Mallorca off the coast of Spain in 1713. So Serra would have been a slightly older contemporary of the founding fathers of our country, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, etc. He joins the Franciscan order as a young man of 16. And he took the name Junípero after brother Juniper, who was the best friend of St. Francis. He becomes a highly regarded theologian in the Franciscan order. I know some of the novices and seminarians know the name John Duns Scotus, the greatest of the Franciscan scholars. And Serra became himself a great student of Duns Scotus, a very highly regarded academic. Well-loved, well-regarded, established in his career. At the age of 35, which at that time was fairly advanced in life, he takes the extraordinary decision to leave his rather comfortable life behind and come to the New World as a missionary. You know, it's hard for us to imagine, we who hop on airplanes and we travel around the whole world in a few hours. But to leave Mallorca at his time, at the age of 35, to come to the New World meant, and he knew it, he'd never go home again. That's why Serra was unwilling even to say goodbye to his parents. You know, he couldn't face them knowing he'd never see them again. He comes across the ocean. He lands at Veracruz on the east coast of Mexico. He makes his way by foot to Mexico City. He wanted to do it in the very poor Franciscan way. And on that journey, something happened to him. Either it was a snake bite or an insect bite or something, but he got an infection in his leg, which meant that for the rest of his life, walking was always very painful for him. He covered thousands of miles on foot, and all of it in pain. He gets to Mexico City, his first stop, and here he reminds us of so many people today, his first stop was the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, to whom he was deeply devoted. He then spends about 12 years in the region north of Mexico City, doing the work of the church, preaching especially. Then he goes to the missions the Jesuits had established in Baja California, worked there for many years. Finally, in his 50s, which at the time was to be a pretty old man, he made his way to our part of the world, to Alta California, and established that wonderful series of missions we know, all the way from San Diego to San Francisco. He dies in 1784, and he's buried at that beautiful mission. I'm sure a lot of you have been there, the beautiful mission in Carmel. So what do we make of this man and his work? Look, it's certainly true that the missions were often accompanied by presidios. That's true. Military and political establishments. It's also true that the Spanish military traveled with Serra as he established his missions. But here's the thing, everybody, which is eminently clear. Just the most cursory survey of the history about Junípero Serra shows. What he was interested in was not the establishment of Spanish political power. It was not the expansion of the Spanish Empire. What preoccupied Junípero Serra exclusively was the proclamation of the Christian gospel. He had in Jesus Christ what he took to be, quite correctly, as the greatest possible gift he could give. And the central preoccupation of his life was to offer this most beautiful gift to the native people of this part of the world. I refuse to accept the characterization of evangelization as some sort of cultural aggression. No, Serra wanted to share what he quite rightly took to be the most precious gift you could ever give. That's what his life was about. In 1773, Junípero Serra made his way, of course, by foot, in constant pain, from Carmel all the way to Mexico City, to argue for a Bill of Rights for the native peoples. Serra stood in a tradition going back 200 years before him to someone like Bartolomé de las Casas. When the Spaniards first arrived in the New World in places like Santo Domingo, from those earliest days, there were churchmen who were speaking up for the rights and prerogatives of the native peoples, who were resisting some of the worst elements of the Spanish occupation. Listen, even now we find those voices stirring. Junípero Serra stood in that tradition. Before we formulated a Bill of Rights on the east coast of our continent, Junípero Serra was fighting for a Bill of Rights for native people in this part of the world. A famous story, and it's reflected in the diaries and the letters. There was an attack on the mission in San Diego by some of the native peoples, burned down the mission, and one of the people they killed was one of Junípero Serra's best friends. Well, there was a great enthusiasm to put to death the perpetrators of this crime. In one of the very first vocal oppositions to capital punishment on this continent, Junípero Serra said no. Let them live that they might be saved. People who'd put to death one of his best friends. Father Tom Elowat is here today. Father Tom is the pastor down at the now Basilica of the Ventura Mission, very proud to say. But he was reminding me just before Mass, and I've come across this too in my research, more and more as the letters and diaries and other historical records of that period emerge, what becomes clear is Serra's deep commitment to the people that he was serving, his willingness to learn their language, their culture, and also what comes through is the deep affection that so many of the native peoples had for him. Again, this characterization of Serra as some agent of Spanish aggression and Spanish colonialism is just a caricature. Maybe just say a couple things about the Spanish colonial system, which nobody wants to celebrate. No one wants to bring it back. But I think it is important to emphasize, certainly true historically, that there were an awful lot of deaths. If you look at the number of native peoples who were here before the Spaniards came and then in the wake of that arrival. But it's certainly fair to observe that the overwhelming majority of those deaths were caused not by abject cruelty, but rather by disease. And I think there's a very clear consensus historically around that. There's also, friends, we have to keep in mind a distinction between the colonialism of the Spaniards and, to be frank, that of the British and the Americans that was far more brutal. In 1851, the very first governor of this territory, before it was a state, basically called for a genocidal war against the native peoples. Show me his statue, I'll join you in tearing it down. But don't lay all of this at the feet of Junípero Serra. It does not belong there. And let's resist together that way too easy caricature. Just a last word, I'll bring it to close with this, about our great feast of the Queenship of Mary. The great biblical reference here, everybody, is from the book of Revelation. And we hear that image of the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. That's Mary being depicted as queen. But remember how that scene unfolds. We understand this queen is also something of a warrior, because she battles the red dragon. You remember that dramatic scene in the book of Revelation? Our Lady of Guadalupe, depicted standing on the moon, referred to as the Empress of the Americas, is very much correlated to Mary in her queenly role. Now here's the thing, everybody. Yes, they're warriors if you want, but not warriors with the weapons of the world. Rather, Our Lady of Guadalupe asserts her power precisely through her identification with the poor, precisely through her compassion, precisely through the fact that she is the mother of those whom she addresses. That's how her queenly power is expressed. That's how she's the Empress of the Americas. As I mentioned, Junípero Serra had a deep devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And one of his best biographers said this: he took Our Lady of Guadalupe as his great model for evangelization. As everyone points out, La Marronita, the little brown-skinned girl, is neither Spanish nor Indian, but a mestiza. And that Serra saw in this the model of appropriate evangelization, to bring the gift of the gospel and to introduce it into a culture in a way that allows for that mixing to take place. Can I suggest now, as we bring this to a close, that we look now not so much to the past, but look to the present and look to the future. Under the queenship of Mary, led by the Empress of the Americas, under the direction of Our Lady of Guadalupe, who inspired Junípero Serra, may we too unleash the power of the gospel, which is precisely the power of compassionate love. Let's go forth in that spirit, everybody, and that's how we best give honor to the great saint Junípero Serra.